Now in 16.3, we're going to pick up with some short-run options that we have to do supply-side policy. So we were talking about taxes on the previous set of slides. Now let's talk a little bit about tax incentives from the point of view of tax elasticity of supply. We've already pointed out that high marginal tax rates shift the aggregate supply curve to the left, which is a bad thing, right? Because shifting the supply curve, the aggregate supply curve to the left simultaneously reduces output and raises unemployment and increases inflation. We don't want that to happen. How do high marginal tax rates do that? Well, we went through an example, and I just used myself as an example of why some professor might refuse to work in the summers, because at those super high tax rates, it just doesn't make sense. I'd rather, go play on my boat. And of course, there are literally millions of workers making those decisions, not for teaching in the summer, but for some part of their job. The boss is asking them to either work overtime, take a promotion and move to another city. There's a whole bunch of things that would normally be a really good thing for both the worker and for the society as a whole, because it would increase the productivity and the output of society. But the worker, because of the high tax rates, chooses not to do so. And that was what that whole purpose of that previous set of slides was all about. In this particular slide, we're going to compare changing the marginal tax rate with a tax rebate. I presume you have heard of tax rebates, where especially when the economy is in bad shape, the government oftentimes gives a tax rebate to stimulate the economy. Now that is going to be stimulating not the aggregate supply curve, but the aggregate demand curve. Because remember, a tax rebate, which is a one-time refund or a one-time gift of money to a person, does not change the underlying tax structure. So for instance, let's go back to my example of me making a decision in April. Do I want to accept Mercer's offer to teach in the summertime? If I get a tax rebate, I'll be happy, and I'll take the money and I'll spend it. There's no doubt my demand will shift, but does it really affect my decision whether I'm going to teach in the summer or not if the tax rate still remains high? Well, of course not. It has no effect at all. And that's the problem with tax rebates. They only stimulate aggregate demand. They don't stimulate aggregate supply. And so supply-siders who focus on the supply curve, they really prefer to have lower marginal tax rates. Whereas Keynesians who are more worried about stimulating demand during bad economic times, they tend to concentrate on things more like tax rebates and don't think as much about marginal tax rates. Now, of course, we're separating these two groups of people, the Keynesians and the supply-siders, into two separate groups, partly artificially, because, obviously, if I can teach it in this particular class, obviously people who make a living doing this understand these arguments. So it's not like the Keynesians don't understand the supply side argument and the supply siders don't understand the Keynesian argument. It's where they emphasize things, where they think the most important emphasis should be placed. That's where the two divide up into two different groups, because they both agree that the underlying theories of both shifting aggregate demand and aggregate supply are both correct. It's just a matter of what do you want to emphasize. So supply-siders, again, they emphasize the marginal tax rate, getting it down low enough that people are not discouraged from taking on extra responsibilities. Now, the last thing discussed in this particular slide is called the tax elasticity of supply. And this is a technical measure. As you can see the formula, it's what the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in tax rate. So on the top part of the formula, let's put in labor hours as an example of something we want to keep track of. So let's do the tax elasticity of supply of professors. Okay, so now we're asking, if we change Professor Petrono's tax rate upwards from 30% up to 50%, what will happen to the percentage change in the number of hours he works in a year? Well, if he takes the summer off, do you all agree that if the high tax rate discouraged me from working in the summer, do you all agree the top number on the formula would be a reduction or a negative number of hours, and the bottom number would be a positive increase in tax rates? So you'd end up with a negative number that says if you increase the tax rate from 30% to 50%, Petrono cuts back 25% on the number of hours he works in a year. Okay, so that would be an example of how you would use the tax elasticity of supply. So the point I want you all to recognize is that, of course, every profession, depending on the structure of its profession, the tax elasticity of supply could either be a very large number, meaning that the tax rates really change behavior a lot, or you could be in a different kind of structure, like someone who's on a year-round contract working 9 to 5, really has no choice as to whether to work in the summer or not. Their tax elasticity supply might be relatively low. Now, you combine them, all of the elasticities of all workers together, and you get the nationwide total tax elasticity of supply. Supply-siders believe this number is relatively high and therefore is dangerous when the government raises tax rates too high, because it discourages the quantity supplied of whatever it is that you're interested in, either labor hours, numbers of dollars that investors invest in new businesses, the number of entrepreneurs who start new businesses. You could measure several different things on this tax elasticity of supply. But in every case, on the bottom half of the fraction, you're looking at a change in the tax rate, and then on the top half of the fraction, you're looking at the response of people in the amount of things that they do. Okay? Now let's take a look at some specific tax incentives for saving. Again, we're going to go back to this issue of the debate between Keynesians and supply-siders. Keynesians generally are not super happy with savings because they see it as a deterrent to spending. It's a leakage from the circular flow. This goes back to the Great Depression. Think about the problem. When people are losing their jobs, their savings rates tend to go up a lot. So picture yourself, if you are in the middle of a recession and you're fearing that your boss is going to lay you off and you're holding on to your job by the skin of your teeth because you can see all around you, whatever industry you're in is not doing very well, how strongly do you feel that it's a good time to go out and buy a nice new car or buy a new house? Well, of course not. You're going to be discouraged from doing that. So therefore, you increase your savings. Under those conditions, increased savings actually reduces the economy even further, doesn't it? Because when you're scared to buy a new car and you don't buy the new car, then obviously General Motors and Ford and Toyota start to lay auto workers off. Because if you're not buying the car, they're not going to keep them on the payroll. The workers get laid off. So you see the problem Keynesians have with savings. They see savings as potentially damaging aggregate demand. The supply-siders point out, well, that's true, but don't forget, all investments ultimately come from savings. Business people cannot invest unless somebody saves the money first. Because obviously, if consumers don't save, that means they're spending the money on consumption. And if they're consuming everything, there's no money left over to buy equipment with. So here is an interesting problem, and this is what the supply-siders focus on. So let's get back to our actual slide. So supply-siders emphasize the importance of savings for financing more investment and economic growth. So investing can only take place when there's savings. So supply-siders generally favor tax incentives that encourage greater savings and investment. We're going to focus on savings in this particular example. I tossed up a couple of examples here at the very bottom. I presume everyone knows what a 401k plan is, what an IRA is, what a Roth IRA. I'm not going to go into detail because this is not a personal investments class, but 401k plans were instituted in the tax law to give businesses the ability to offer their employees a tax deferred mechanism for investing. So if your company has a 401k plan, you can take money out of your paycheck before you pay the taxes. It removes the income, so your reported income goes down, so you're now in a lower tax bracket. So you essentially get a tax incentive or a marginal tax decrease by investing money in a 401k plan. And then over your lifetime, of course, if that 401k builds up over time because you're investing in stocks and bonds, your total savings by the end of your life is nice and high and you have a good, comfortable retirement. That's the purpose for the individual of a 401k. But what does it do for society as a whole? Remember, if you're putting money in a 401k, all that money is going into the stock market, and then ultimately the companies that sell stock to get the money to buy equipment are able now to be able to expand their operations even further. So every dollar of money invested in a 401k eventually ends up as an investment in trucks and machines and factory buildings and all the other things that make society more productive. So supply-siders are big fans of anything that gets people to save more money, and these three I tossed up here are examples of exceptions in the tax code that let you reduce your tax rate if you choose to save. Now let's talk about tax incentives for investments. Now here we're talking about not investing in the stock market. We're talking about the business people actually buying new equipment, new factory buildings, things like that. That's what we mean by investment in an economics class. So supply-siders also advocate tax incentives for investments. Things such as reduced taxes on capital gains, reduced taxes on dividends, larger capital expensing for new investments, which I'll mention in just a minute what those things are. But these are mechanisms that reduce the taxes on business people if they agree to increase their investing in new plant equipment. So the goal is to expand the investment spending, which increases the capacity to produce. So by definition, that shifts the aggregate supply curve to the right. And then we get all those good things we talked about earlier in the previous set of slides about increasing aggregate supply. So what kind of things are we asking the government to do? Such as, there's a couple, not all of them, there are literally hundreds of things that you could do in the tax code, but I'm going to just mention a handful of them. Accelerated depreciation is one of them. For those of you who've taken your accounting class that's required, usually for MBA programs, you take an accounting class, you remember that businesses are permitted to subtract from their revenue something called depreciation. Picture a trucking company. You buy a brand new truck for $100,000. It lasts 10 years. Obviously, the truck falls in value $10,000 every year. That's a nice, simple way of thinking about it, right? So if the truck is wearing out $10,000 a year, is it legitimate to subtract that $10,000 from your revenue before you pay your taxes? Well, of course it is. You want to truthfully only pay taxes on what you truly earn. So if your truck is being consumed and in 10 years you have to buy a new truck, you should be able to deduct that from your taxes. Now, accelerated depreciation means instead of letting you deduct $10,000 every year from the value of your truck, why don't we let you deduct $20,000 for the first 5 years? You still only get to deduct $100,000 in total because that's how much the truck loses value over the lifetime. But instead you front load all that depreciation so you get to write off more faster in the front end. What does this do? It reduces your taxes today so that you can now spend more on plant and equipment. So that's the whole theory of accelerated depreciation. A capital gains tax, what is that? The capital gains tax is a tax on capital gains. Picture in your mind, you buy a house for $200,000, 10 years later you sell it for $300,000. You made a capital gain in that example of $100,000, right? The $200,000 house grew to $300,000, so the gain you made on the sale of your house is a capital gain. Capital gains are often taxed at lower rates than ordinary income. Under what principle? We want business people to invest in new businesses. And so if businesses become more valuable when you sell them, and usually for the ordinary individual that's done through the stock market, because you participate in Home Depot, not by starting a new store, you personally, I mean, you participate in Home Depot by owning their stock. So if Home Depot is constantly investing in new stores and growing the company, and your stock goes from being a $100 stock to a $150 stock, you've gained 50%, just like in the house example. The capital gains tax rate on your gain will be lower than ordinary income to give you an incentive to invest in the stock market in the first place. Because investing in the stock market ultimately transfers money to companies like Home Depot, where they can now invest in new plant and equipment, which is, of course, the whole goal of aggregate supply people known as supply-siders. They want society to be working harder, and they want them to be working with more equipment in order to stimulate aggregate supply. How about human capital investment? Under human capital investment, we recognize that, and we've talked about this before, that human capital is what? Your knowledge, education, training, skill, experience that makes you more productive. So anything that can increase human capital also increases the ability of society to produce. It also reduces something called structural unemployment. Remember, we discussed this issue. Structural unemployment means that we have workers and we also have jobs available, but unfortunately the skills of the workers don't match the available jobs, which means the worker stays unemployed even though they're looking for a job and even knock on the door of the company that's looking to hire workers, but they turn the worker down because they say, sorry, we can't use you, you don't have the right skill. So structural unemployment usually is long-term unemployment. It's very difficult to overcome structural unemployment. The worker has to get retrained at some new occupation that makes them more productive. So how do we do this? Well, supply-siders want the government to provide tax credits to employers who offer work training. They want to expand the educational system. They want to reduce discriminatory barriers. They want to do all these kinds of things. Anything that makes a worker more productive by putting them in the right job and getting them the training to handle a better job would be something that would increase the total aggregate supply. Now, on the very last bullet point, I wanted to carve that one out separately, because all of the other bullet points, the supply-siders want the government to increase spending on those things, but on the last thing, they want them to decrease spending. And what are these things? These are known as transfer payments. A transfer payment is just a nice fancy word for things like welfare payments, rent subsidies, anything where the government is transferring income to another person who did not earn that income. It's essentially a gift, right? So all the things I mentioned, charity, food stamps, Section 8 housing that gives you into an apartment you can't afford by subsidizing the apartment, all of those things are examples of transfer payments. The problem with transfer payments is they oftentimes become a barrier for workers to find a job or to improve their position by getting better jobs. Why? Because transfer payments usually work on some kind of graduated system that as your income rises, they cut back on the benefits, which makes sense, right? I mean, we don't want to give food stamps to millionaires. It only makes sense to give them to poor people. Well, if poor people get better jobs, they no longer are poor people. So what happens to their ability to keep getting the food stamps? Well, of course, the food stamps cut back, don't they? Well, herein lies a problem. What if you're a worker who recognizes, I could get the extra training my boss offers and accept the new job, which will give me more money. That's a good thing. But unfortunately, it's going to put me at the higher end of the income bracket, and therefore I can't get my food stamps anymore. That turns into what's called an implicit tax rate. You aren't literally being charged an extra tax, but if you give up your food stamps to take the better job, it is the same effect as a tax increase, right? And we've already gone through the example of marginal taxes in the previous slides, where I use my own example of not wanting to teach in the summer because at the high tax rate, I'd rather go sailing. I don't keep enough money to make it worth my while. Well, could the same thing happen to a worker who was on food stamps, who's now scared of losing the food stamps if they get a raise? What does that do to incentive to do better at work? That's what the supply-siders are worried about. They're worried about the transfer payment system becoming excessive enough that it discourages workers from bettering themselves. And they've got a legitimate worry there. But of course, we also have to worry about people being so poor they can't feed themselves. What do you do about that? Well, unfortunately, nothing in life is easy. Everything's a trade-off. But supply-siders just want to make sure that government officials recognize that if you make transfer payments too easy, you run the serious risk of de-skilling the workforce because you've damaged the incentives.